When Herbert and Louisa Sotterley arrived by steamship in 1910 to view the 400-acre farm they had purchased, the property had fallen considerably from its former glory as an 18th-century plantation. As the Sotterleys looked around them at the shabby buildings and neglected grounds, they envisioned restoring Sotterley as a charming country retreat and as a symbol of a romantic colonial past. Many Americans in the early 20th century idealized the colonial period as an antidote to the complexities of the present and imagined it as a time of patriotic unity, noble deeds, and simpler values. Herbert Sotterley, a well-regarded lawyer whose clients included Mark Twain, had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Teddy Roosevelt and was a deeply patriotic man. His wife Louisa was the daughter of Wall Street mogul J.P. Morgan. Their wedding 10 years earlier had been the highlight of the New York social season. Herbert and Louisa, fueled by enthusiasm for colonial revival and believing that Sotterley connected them to ancestral roots in England, drew on their ample wealth in restoring Sotterley according to their vision of the manor house of a Southern Maryland gentleman in 1776. What you see as you look around this site today largely reflects that vision. But where does Sotterley's story begin? Let's travel back through time on a voyage of discovery to catch a glimpse of a time before Sotterley existed, back to the early 17th century and the journeys of Captain John Smith.
There is but one entrance by sea into this country, and that is at the mouth of a very goodly bay, the wideness whereof...
In Captain John Smith's time, the Chesapeake Bay was one of the richest estuaries in the world, teeming with wildlife. Indigenous peoples had been living along the Patuxent River for over 9,000 years, developing strategies and tools to adapt to their environment and sustain life.
The fifth river is called Patuxent. Upon this river dwelled the people called the Aquatinuxuic, Patuxent, and Mattaponiant.
By the mid-17th century, life in southern Maryland had undergone dramatic upheaval as immigrant tobacco and livestock farmers disrupted ancient cultural and land use patterns. Pressures from colonial settlements and northern Indians eventually forced the native Patuxent people from their traditional homes. The plantation that became known as Sotterley was established around the turn of the 18th century and has been a part of the landscape and fabric of southern Maryland for over 3 centuries. The people who resided here at Sotterley left behind an historical legacy that is recorded on the plantation's surrounding landscape. The fields, creeks, main house, and outbuildings are the visible remains of past lives. Of the 4 families who owned Sotterley over the centuries, the first were the Bowles. Around 1699, James Bowles, son of a wealthy London sugar and tobacco merchant, arrived in the area looking for land to establish a plantation. He purchased 2,000 acres on the Patuxent River and built a 2-room house overlooking an inlet now known as Sotterley Creek. Recent dendrochronology dates the construction of those first 2 rooms of the Sotterley Manor House to around 1703, making it one of the oldest house museums in the nation. Bowles prospered, growing tobacco and, like Sotterley owners to follow, raising other crops and livestock as well. He was also the first, but not last owner, to bolster his status and wealth through lucrative government posts, marriage into prominent families, and through his participation in the slave trade. From the logs of the Royal African Company.
July 6, 1720. Shipped on board 260 slaves, 124 men, 112 women, and 26 boys and 8 girls, consigned to Mr. James Bowles at Patuxent River in Maryland.
Bowles displayed his wealth and elite standing through the trafficking of enslaved Africans and purchase of the luxury goods of his time, silver, fine wines, and books. He enlarged the house, adding a 3rd room, cellar, closets, and a second-story bedroom. When Bowles died in 1727, he left his property, including 41 slaves, to his young widow. In 1729, that widow, Rebecca Addison Bowles, married George Plater, the first of 4 successive George Platers to own the property and give it the name Sotterley in memory of an ancestral home in Suffolk. When you take the mansion tour, you'll hear more about this illustrious family, which included Governor George Plater, who played a role in the American Revolution and was the 6th governor of Maryland. During the Plater period, Sotterley survived British raids in 2 wars. People of African descent were bought and sold, worked, resisted, and sometimes escaped. Crops and livestock were grown and harvested, marriages formed, babies birthed, lives ended. The Platers' political prominence and property increased. The house grew in size and elegance, and Maryland went from being a colony to being a state in a newly formed country. At its height, Sotterley's 7,000 acres made the Platers one of the largest landowners in Maryland, but battered by loss of slaves freed during wars with the British, fluctuating markets, and an accumulated mountain of debt, the last Plater owner, the 5th George, was finally forced to sell the property in 1822 to his father's executor. In 1826, under the ownership of Walter Hanson Stone Briscoe, a country doctor with some progressive ideas about education for women, but traditional Southern attitudes toward slavery, Sotterley entered what we call the Briscoe period. Dr. Briscoe gained the property through marriage to Emmeline Dallum. They continued to operate a 400-acre mixed crop farm relying on slave labor, and in the mid-1800s, Sotterley Wharf became a busy steamboat landing. A Briscoe daughter and granddaughter, educated at the school on site, became early principals of St. Mary's Female Seminary, now St. Mary's College of Maryland. And between 1861 and 1865, Sotterley survived yet another war. The Civil War uprooted a pattern of life and a system of labor that had persisted at Sotterley since its beginning. We have gained valuable insights into 19th century slave life at Sotterley through the research of Agnes Kane Callum, a former Sotterley trustee.
My people survived the system because they knew when to act and when not to act. This was a plantation with slaves, overseer, everything that went along with slavery happened here. Everyone was seeking freedom. Their challenge was how to be free.
When the war came, 3 of Briscoe's sons joined the Confederacy, and at least one of his slaves, George Briscoe, escaped to join the Union's United States Colored Troops. The ex-slave and the slave owner's son fought on opposing sides in the Battle of Petersburg. In 1864, as the war was coming to an end, Maryland granted the freedom long sought by Agnes Kane Callum's ancestors, and 160 years of slavery at Sotterley came to an end. In St. Mary's County, isolation intensified the poverty that followed the collapse of the plantation economy. Times were tough for farmers who had relied on slave labor, and there were few economic opportunities for folks freed from slavery. Some of the former slaves stayed on after the war as domestic workers or farm laborers, and a few of the slave quarters were still occupied when Herbert and Louisa Satterley purchased Sotterley in 1910. As the Satterleys began renovations, local craftsmen were hired to build houses for Sotterley staff, and Charles H. Knott, who served as farm manager from 1910 to 1960, was hired to oversee farm operations. The house built for Mr. Knott and his family is now the Sotterley Visitors Center. Members of the Knott family have continued to tend to the Sotterley farm for over a century. Charles Knott's son, Richard, who started working as a boy in 1935 for 10 cents an hour, lives nearby and keeps a caring eye on the site. The Satterley family including daughter Mabel, who was to become the last family owner, visited several times a year, arriving by steamship or chauffeur-driven car. When her father died in 1947, Mabel Sotterley Ingalls purchased Sotterley.
I think she was really unhappy that he didn't leave Sotterley to her. But she decided, and I remember her telling me, I'm going to purchase Sotterley because I think it is a very important house and property, and it also is a she didn't say this, but it was a real connection to her father because she loved him, she admired him, and so anything that reminded her of that connection was important.
Dr. Ingalls, an educator, researcher, world traveler, and avid outdoorswoman, visited Sotterley as often as she could, preserving and improving the house and grounds, entertaining friends, and indulging her passion for hunting and fishing. Generations of the Scriber and Barber families worked the fields, cared for the grounds, and performed domestic chores just as they had during her father's time. Sotterley trustee Donald Barber and his brother Gerard, whose parents and grandparents worked at Sotterley, grew up on the site.
My father, even though he had kind of a hard, rough life, was a very nice, kind-hearted kind of person. I mean, I have fond memories of working here because we worked with him.
We were the history. I didn't put two and two together really until you got to like junior high school or high school, and you start to learn about history and learn about what landmarks and what was going on in the country when this place was being built. And then it took on a whole different picture of, a lot of that stuff happened right here.
In 1960, Mabel Ingalls made the decision to establish a nonprofit foundation in order to preserve Sotterley and protect it from development and make its house and grounds accessible to the public. Designated a National Historic Landmark in 2000, Sotterley today is the only remaining tidewater plantation in Maryland that is open to the public, with a full range of visitor activities and educational programs. Its architectural features include the plantation house, a rare surviving 1830s slave cabin, and a full array of outbuildings set amidst 94 acres of rolling fields, gardens, and riverfront. Trails provide visitors with opportunities to view ecological zones and learn about the bay. Docent-led and audio tours offer visitors views and stories of the mansion and grounds and the people who played the varied roles that kept Sotterley functioning as a farm over the centuries. Award-winning educational programming on site serves over 6,000 Maryland school children every year. Special annual events like the Riverside Wine Fest, Garden Fair, Speaker Series, Independence Day concert, and holiday candlelight and ghost tours bring in over 9,000 guests yearly, and the site is a popular choice for weddings and special parties. The friendly Sotterley staff and volunteers work hard to make visitors' experiences rewarding and to keep the institution humming. Knowledgeable preservation and maintenance managers oversee necessary repairs on the historic buildings, and the colonial garden is maintained by dedicated volunteers. Descendants of former Sotterley owners and free and enslaved workers serve on the Sotterley Board of Trustees. The labor and love of many generations of owners, workers, managers, foundation members, and volunteers have allowed Sotterley to survive into its 4th century. With the support of visitors like you, who come to learn about our shared past and celebrate community in the present, Sotterley will not only survive, but thrive far into the future.
my people that are living today, they are proud. They are proud of our ancestors.